Johnny Johnson was born in 1978. His life ended at the age of 45 after 21 long years on death row on the fateful day of August 1st, 2023. His victim was little Casey Williamson, only 6 years old, a tender life extinguished by the very hands of someone she had once trusted. On that sweltering August afternoon, in the near-absolute silence of the execution chamber at the Bonne Terre Correctional Center in Missouri, the circle of Johnny Johnson's fate closed. His final moments were defined by a strangely stark detail. Was it a final attempt to cling to a shred of normalcy in an extraordinary reality? Or was it the ultimate insensitivity of a man whose conscience had been eroded by his crime? Before being taken to the lethal injection gurney, he left a hastily written note on paper. God bless. Sorry to the people and family I hurt. 2 short sentences for a human life. But for the victim's family, those words echoed in a hopeless void, an effort too little too late for an unforgivable crime. For them, justice was not in words, but in the action about to take place behind that door. Johnny Johnson's journey from his most brutal acts to his final moments in the execution chamber is a haunting story of crime punishment and the lingering question of remorse. To better understand, let us return to July 2002. In Valley Park, Missouri, a small and peaceful suburban town life was simple. On the afternoon of July 21, 2002, a cozy barbecue was held at the home of Casey Williamson's father. Everyone was happy, completely unaware of the nightmare about to strike. Among the guests was 24-year-old Johnny Johnson. He was no stranger. Johnson was the younger brother of Casey's mother's best friend, a familiar face, a person the family trusted enough to allow to sleep on their sofa. This very trust became the weapon the monster exploited. The next morning, on July 22nd, 6-year-old Casey Williamson disappeared from her home. The peace was shattered. The search began immediately. Neighbors, police, and volunteers scoured the area. Fear crept in. No one suspected that the perpetrator was not some phantom, but the very man who had slept in their house, joined their party, and was now playing the part of an innocent man. The Casey Williamson case left a deep scar on the soul of Valley Park. Johnny Johnson's path of crime began with cruel deception and ended with unimaginable savagery. Early that morning, around 6 a.m., he used his familiarity to lure Casey to a nearby abandoned glass factory. To a 6-year-old child, the word of a familiar adult is a guarantee of safety. Casey, innocent, followed without a hint of suspicion. At that desolate place, Johnson's true purpose was revealed. He wanted to sexually assault the little girl. But Casey, though small, showed extraordinary courage. She screamed, fought back fiercely, trying to escape the monster's grasp. It was this resistance that triggered Johnson's uncontrollable brutality. Instead of stopping, he acted viciously. He used bricks and large, sharp rocks, repeatedly striking her head until she stopped breathing. He murdered Casey in a savage manner simply because she would not let him carry out his depraved act. After the murder, Johnson continued his cold-blooded calculations. He dragged the little girl's body into a pit, covering it carelessly with rocks and leaves. To hide the evidence, he went to the bank of the Merrimack River, washed away all the blood, then returned to the scene, pretending to join the sham search. He could wash away the blood, but he could not wash away the guilt and the truth. What kind of demon created Johnny Johnson? Looking into his past, we see a complex picture of mental illness and brutal behavior. Johnson was diagnosed with schizophrenia and may have had an intellectual disability. Johnson had a history of substance abuse and had been in and out of mental health facilities multiple times. The tragic key lies in January 2002, 6 months before the murder. Johnson had voluntarily stopped taking his schizophrenia medication because it made him feel like a zombie. This decision was a heartbreaking turning point. Without the medication to control them, delusions and paranoid thoughts may have taken over his mind. However, does that excuse a premeditated murder and a calculated cover-up? The fact that he exploited trust, planned the enticement, and made efforts to erase the evidence shows a certain level of awareness and cunning. Prosecutors emphasize this to prove he was not completely insane. Let's talk about Casey Williamson, a 6-year-old girl, a life that had just begun with dreams yet to be fulfilled. Casey was a little angel, her family's infinite joy, with a radiant smile that was always present. Her death is a void that can never be filled. The family's pain is immeasurable. For more than 2 decades, they have had to live with the image of their daughter, their granddaughter, being brutally murdered. Every passing day was a struggle with horrifying memories. Casey's aunt Della Steele became a powerful voice for justice. She fought tirelessly to ensure Johnny Johnson would pay the price. In an emotional plea to the governor, she urged the execution to be carried out. He did a horrible thing. He took the life of a completely innocent child, and he must surely face the consequences. For the Williamson family, this was not revenge, but an affirmation that Casey's life was precious and that the crime had to be punished to the fullest extent in order to find some peace. The search for Casey lasted less than 12 hours. The decisive clue came from the mouth of the killer himself. Johnny Johnson, the man who had slept at the victim's house, initially tried to mislead the investigation, pretending to join the search. Under the pressure of the investigation, and perhaps the weight of his guilt, Johnny Johnson broke down. In the interrogation room, he confessed everything. He showed investigators the location of the abandoned glass factory and where he had buried Casey's body. His confession closed the tragic search and opened the journey to justice. When Casey's body was found, the entire community was plunged into grief and outrage. When arrested, Johnson showed little reaction. He seemed to accept his fate with a terrifying emptiness after committing such a horrific crime. He was charged with first-degree murder and held without bail. In court, a fierce legal battle erupted. The prosecutors had irrefutable evidence of a brutal, calculated murder. They detailed Johnson's actions from luring the victim to concealing the crime. The defense attorneys argued that Johnson lacked the mental capacity to bear the highest responsibility based on his schizophrenia diagnosis and a Supreme Court ruling prohibiting the execution of the severely mentally ill. They argued that he believed in delusions and could not control his actions. However, the prosecution strongly rebutted this. They argued that his systematic actions to conceal the crime, burying the body bathing in the river, showed that he was fully aware that what he did was wrong. The jury, after weighing the evidence, agreed with the prosecution. They saw a cold-blooded killer, a predator who had exploited trust, not a mental patient who had lost control of his actions. The final verdict was delivered firm and clear: death. 21 years. Johnny Johnson lived on death row at the Bonne Terre Correctional Center in Missouri. His life was a repeating cycle within 4 walls, along with a relentless legal battle. His lawyers continuously filed appeals arguing that Johnson's mental state was deteriorating and that executing a mentally ill person was unconstitutional. Throughout those years, Johnson rarely showed public remorse. His prison records indicated he still exhibited abnormal behavior, but not enough for higher courts to grant his lawyers' requests. Just a week before the execution date, a glimmer of hope appeared when a federal court issued a stay. But that hope was quickly extinguished just a day later when the full appellate court voted to reverse the stay. Governor Mike Parson also denied clemency, declaring that justice for Casey must be served. All legal doors had closed. Johnny Johnson's fate was sealed. August 1st, 2023. This was Johnny Johnson's last day. He was awakened early in the morning, prepared for the end. In his final hours, Johnson had the opportunity to meet with his lawyer and some relatives through a glass partition. His last meal was a bacon cheeseburger, curly fries, and a strawberry milkshake. He ate it all slowly and without showing much emotion. After the meal, Johnny Johnson was taken to the execution chamber. He was placed on the lethal injection gurney, the straps tightened. He did not resist, did not scream, seemingly having accepted his fate. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, and absolutely silent. Before the drugs were administered, Johnny Johnson's final words were read by a prison official. "God bless. Sorry to the people and family I hurt." Those were the last words of a man who had committed a horrific crime. After the final words, the execution process began. A dose of pentobarbital was injected into Johnny Johnson's vein. A few minutes later, Johnny Johnson, the 45-year-old murderer, closed his eyes forever. At 6:33 p.m. on August 1st, 2023, he was pronounced dead. For the Williamson family, the execution cannot bring Casey back. The pain will never disappear. But as Governor Mike Parson said, the hope is that carrying out the sentence might bring some comfort and a sense that justice has finally been served. Della Steele Casey's aunt stated that her family finally had the closure they had awaited for over 2 decades. More than 2 decades after the horrific crime, the circle of crime and punishment had closed. But its legacy is a painful reminder of the fragility of life, of the cruelty that humans can inflict, and of the endless sorrow of those left behind, forever carrying the image of a little angel who was stolen from the world.